The midwife's hands were slick with blood as she worked frantically to save the life of the 13-year-old girl writhing in agony on the bed. For hours, this child, because that was what she truly was, a child, had been screaming as her barely developed body struggled to accomplish a feat for which it was woefully unprepared. The baby was trapped, and the mother was on the brink of death. In that harrowing moment, as the specter of death loomed over Pembroke Castle in the bitter winter of 1457, everyone in the room understood a truth that history would try to obscure. Margaret Buffett should never have been pregnant in the first place. In the next 15 minutes, I will share a story that has been sanitized by medieval historians for centuries. It is a horrifying account of what transpired when a 12-year-old girl was coerced into marriage with a man twice her age who refused to wait. This is not merely another tale of medieval marriage customs. It is the story of how one man's unchecked greed irrevocably devastated a child's life and the bodies of young girls in a patriarchal society. It is about how the most influential figures in England stood idly by while such horrors unfolded, and how that traumatized little girl would ultimately rise to become one of the most formidable women of Tudor England. What I am about to recount springs from contemporary accounts, medical records, and the chilling confession of Margaret's priest after her death. Yet, there is an even darker aspect to this saga. Margaret Buffett's story was not a solitary tragedy. It was a manifestation of a pattern so grotesque that even within the medieval context, it was recognized as morally reprehensible. Consider this. On May 31st, 1443, a baby girl was born at Bleo Castle in Bedfordshire, named Margaret. From her very first breath, she was not merely a child, she was a commodity. Her father, John Boet, was the Duke of Somerset, one of the most powerful men in England. But within a year of Margaret's birth, fate took a cruel turn. Her father was discovered dead under enigmatic circumstances, sparking whispers throughout the castle halls: suicide. In medieval England, suicide was not only viewed as a sin, but also as a disgrace that stained the reputation of an entire family. Suddenly, baby Margaret morphed from a cherished infant into vulnerable prey. Before she could even walk, vultures began to circle overhead. The 1-year-old infant had inherited a fortune that would make even the most avaricious men drool. Land, titles, wealth, all neatly contained within a package small enough to cradle in one's arms. Margaret's mother, Margaret Beauchamp, desperately tried to shield her daughter, raising her alongside her half-siblings in an environment that, by all rights, should have been nurturing. She ensured that young Margaret received an exceptional education, teaching her to read French and encouraging her to cultivate her keen intelligence. For a fleeting moment, one might dare to hope that this story could take a different path. But King Henry VI had other plans. When Margaret was just 3 years old, the king transferred her as if she were a mere prize to William de la Pole, the Duke of Suffolk. Without hesitation, the Duke executed the predatory plot any vile opportunist might devise. He arranged for his 7-year-old son John to marry this toddler, thus sewing together a horrifying union. A 3-year-old bride, let that sink in. Margaret was likely unable to even articulately pronounce the words of the ceremony, if she could speak at all. The wedding likely transpired between January and February 1450, though conflicting historical records hint at an earlier date. A papal dispensation was required due to the familial connection, and the Pope granted approval in August 1450. Even the Church was complicit in this grotesque arrangement. However, Suffolk's plans suffered a catastrophic blow. By 1453, he found himself arrested and ultimately murdered. His political ascendance was obliterated. In a twist of fate, little Margaret was once again available for marriage, and King Henry VI made a choice that would irrevocably alter her life. He bestowed her upon the Tudor brothers, Edmund and Jasper Tudor, born of King Henry's mother's scandalous second marriage to a Welsh servant named Owen Tudor. Both were ambitious and ruthless, keenly aware of the political machinations of their time, and they had the king's favor. When Edmund Tudor set his sights on 12-year-old Margaret, he did not perceive a child still clutching her dolls. He envisioned a fortune, a vessel for his lineage, and a firm grip on power. Their wedding took place on November 1st, 1455. Margaret was merely 12, while Edmund was 24. It is crucial to recognize that, even in medieval England, where child marriages were commonplace, there existed unspoken guidelines around such unions. You typically did not consummate the marriage until the girl was at least 14, preferably older. This was not out of benevolence but rather practicality. They understood that pregnancy could lead to devastation for young girls. They had witnessed it unfold before their eyes. Yet, Edmund Tudor was indifferent to these principles. In what could only be described as a monstrous decision, within days of their wedding, possibly even on their wedding night, this 24-year-old man sexually assaulted his 12-year-old bride. This is not hyperbole or exaggeration, but a stark reality. Margaret was unable to provide legal consent, lacking even the emotional agency required for such a union. Her body was ill-equipped for the grim violation that ensued. Historian Elizabeth Norton bluntly articulated what many knew. Child marriages were socially acceptable during the 15th century, but consummation with a child was an affront to both morality and practicality. Edmund had cold, calculating reason, ends for his actions. Under medieval law, if an heiress died without producing children, her lands reverted to her family. However, if she perished after having given birth, her husband retained her fortune for life. Edmund looked upon this 12-year-old girl, crafted a monstrous calculation in his mind, and concluded that the sooner he impregnated her, the sooner he could secure his wealth, even at the expense of her life. By April 1456, Margaret was, tragically, pregnant, at the tender age of 12. Imagine being thrust into a state of confusion and fear, your body undergoing changes you cannot comprehend. Visualize the terror of morning sickness while still grappling with the remnants of childhood. Envision trying to fathom the enormity of carrying a child you never requested, planted there by a man who regarded you merely as a monetary asset. But Margaret's nightmare was about to intensify. In July 1456, Edmund Tudor was captured during a tumultuous phase of the Wars of the Roses. Imprisoned in Carmarthen Castle, he met his end by November, their first wedding anniversary, officially attributed to the plague, though conspiracy theories suggested more nefarious causes. Margaret was now 13, 7 months pregnant, and utterly alone. She could have chosen to stay in a more stable location, but Margaret made the courageous decision to traverse treacherous roads in the midst of civil war to find sanctuary at Pembroke Castle under the guard of her brother-in-law, Jasper Tudor. The perilous journey could have easily claimed her life as she navigated hostile territories, her frail young body already stretched to the brink of endurance. She arrived at Pembroke Castle, where, on January 28, 1457, Margaret Buffett's true ordeal would begin. Labor commenced, and immediately it was clear that something was profoundly wrong. Margaret was petite for her age, described by contemporaries as small and slight. Her hips had not broadened. Her body had yet to fully develop. The baby was on its way, but there was no passage for it to navigate. Hours of excruciating labor dragged on. The midwives exchanged alarmed glances, shifting in their unease. With hundreds of deliveries under their belts, their instincts told them this was different. This was a child, not a woman in labor. What transpired within that room is lost to time, but the aftermath reveals a tragic truth. The birth was so immensely traumatic that it rendered Margaret incapable of bearing more children, even after remarrying twice. In an age when women were typically expected to bear numerous heirs, 10, 12, perhaps even 15, Margaret Buffett's ability to produce just one child serves as a stark testament to the extent of the physical destruction inflicted upon her through that harrowing experience. The baby survived, and he would be named Henry, future King Henry VIII and founder of the Tudor dynasty. Nevertheless, survival for Margaret came with a gut-wrenching cost that she would bear for the rest of her life. John Fisher, who eventually became Margaret's confessor and confidant, in a sermon delivered after her death in 1509, expressed astonishment, claiming it was a miracle that such a small figure delivered a child. His remarks highlight how even decades later, in an era desensitized to child marriage, the shock of Margaret's survival resonated deeply. But mere survival does not equate to a life free of consequences. Modern medical knowledge illuminates the likely physical implications of Margaret's ordeal. When a young girl gives birth before her body has properly matured, the results can be catastrophic. A baby may become lodged in the birth canal, leading to grievous injuries, tissue damage, fistulas, and scars that last a lifetime. The hours of prolonged labor would have compounded these risks, most likely inflicting injuries that would be termed horrific even under contemporary medical standards. The psychological trauma is equally unfathomable. Consider a 13-year-old girl, orphaned by her father's suicide, sexually assaulted by her husband, widowed while pregnant, and then nearly killed in the process of delivering his child. Is it any wonder that the bond Margaret formed with her son became a defining and consuming obsession in her life? Some historians suggest that her love for Henry bordered on the obsessive and could be understood as a trauma response stemming from the perilous experience of nearly losing both their lives during childbirth. Yet, as the tale unfolds, Margaret Buffett transforms her horror into empowerment. Decades later, when her granddaughter, another Margaret, was betrothed to the King of Scotland at a vulnerable age, Margaret Boet resolutely fought against the union. Both she and her daughter-in-law, Elizabeth of York, passionately lobbied King Henry VIII on behalf of the young girl, expressing their concerns that the King of Scots would not wait, jeopardizing her health. This response, 50 years after her own traumatic experience, illustrates Margaret's enduring trauma. She understood all too well the implications of being rushed into adulthood, having lived the devastating consequences firsthand. Yet, despite her staunch efforts, the political machine continued to churn, and young Margaret Tudor found herself dispatched to Scotland to enter marriage at the tender age of 13, just like her grandmother. This repeating cycle paints a stark picture of Margaret Buffett's life. It transcends being merely a historical tragedy. It reveals the grim mechanisms of power in medieval England, where women were routinely objectified, and even survivors of abuse inevitably became complicit in perpetuating the very system that had exploited them. Margaret ultimately emerged as one of the most powerful women in England, a political strategist whose influence helped craft the Tudor rise to power. However, the specter of the trauma she endured at Pembroke Castle never left her. She never bore another child thereafter, and despite her efforts to shield her granddaughter from a similar fate, she failed. Modern historians have sought to soften parts of Margaret's narrative, referencing the differing societal norms of her time. They note that she seemingly retained some form of affection for Edmund's memory, requesting to be buried beside him rather than her later husband's. But trauma often manifests in unequivocally complex ways. While Stockholm Syndrome wasn't a known concept in the 15th century, the psychology of enduring such trauma is timeless. When a young girl is told by the most powerful figures in her life that her suffering is tantamount to God's will, what choice remains but to internalize those expectations? Even by medieval standards, what transpired with Margaret Buffett was recognized as fundamentally wrong. The customary age for consummation was typically no younger than 14, often later. Noble families would frequently negotiate contracts forbidding consummation until the bride was older, acknowledging the dangers posed to younger girls. Edmund Tudor's disregard for these conventions and his choice to violate a 12-year-old, single-mindedly aiming for quick financial gain, was a betrayal recognized even by his contemporaries. Yet, society allowed the horror to unfold, as Margaret was not seen as a person, but as property, fit to be traded, sold, and exploited. The king's decision to hand her to Edmund, the nobles who endorsed the wedding, and the priests who blessed the union all understood the likely fate awaiting her, yet remained silent. This system is part and parcel of what contributed to the establishment of the Tudor dynasty. The suffering, pain, and trauma inflicted upon Margaret Buffett set the stage for Henry VII's ascension, and thus paved the way for the likes of Henry VIII with his 6 wives, and Elizabeth I, the so-called Virgin Queen. Margaret Buffett survived. She even thrived in her own way. She became the founder of colleges at Cambridge. Christ's College and St. John's College honor her legacy to this day. She emerged as a benefactor of education, a political force, a woman who signed her name with an air of regal confidence. Margaret R., as if she were a queen in her own right. However, none of those achievements can erase the trauma she endured during that fateful event at Pembroke Castle. When she passed away on June 29, 1509, just 5 days after her 66th birthday, Margaret Buffett had experienced the death of 4 husbands, watched her son ascend to the throne, and seen her grandson, Henry VIII, inherit power. She accumulated immense wealth, shaped English history, yet still bore the scars from her initial ordeal. Sadly, her story is often overshadowed by the glamorous narrative surrounding Tudor history. The focus tends to linger on Henry VII's unions, Elizabeth I's golden era, and the emblematic Tudor rose and the schism with Rome, but we neglect the narrative of the child bride whose suffering birthed it all. We forget to address the undeniable truth that the foundations of the Tudor dynasty were laid upon the shattered body of a 13-year-old girl. Yet, Margaret's story remains relevant today. In a world where child marriage persists, where young girls are still bartered like property, and where their bodies are viewed as commodities ripe for exploitation, Margaret Buffett serves as a poignant reminder, an embodiment of what occurs when we fail to protect our children. Yes, she not only survived but successfully carved out a remarkable existence. But at what cost? The midwife who helped deliver Henry Tudor that day at Pembroke Castle likely returned home believing she had witnessed a miracle, and in a sense, she had. It is indeed miraculous that both Margaret and Henry survived. However, it was also a preventable miracle, one that should never have been necessary had the adults in Margaret's life fulfilled their duty and ensured her protection. Instead, they sacrificed her childhood, her bodily autonomy, and her future progeny on the altar of political ambition. Margaret's narrative deserves to be told in its entirety, not merely as a powerful figure but as a young girl who endured brutalization. Until we confront the true cost of power and acknowledge the human suffering enmeshed within grand narratives, we risk repeating these historical injustices.